If there is one country which can demonstrate how a nation can rise from the ruins and poverty to become one of the world's top economies, all within just a few decades, South Korea is arguably one of the most iconic examples. But if there is also a country which shows how rapid development, industrial miracles, and global cultural influence can simultaneously conceal deep structural problems, such as intense social pressure, widespread depression, and a looming demographic catastrophe, South Korea again stands as a textbook case. South Korea is a nation defined by contradictions. It was capable of shocking economists with the miracle on the Han River, yet it also has some of the highest suicide rates in the world. It is one of the most successful late industrializing countries on Earth, and yet many of its young people feel hopeless. It is a global leader in electronics, shipbuilding, entertainment, and we all know K-pop, but also a society struggling under intense work pressure, collapsing birth rates, class immobility, and the outsized power of conglomerates. How did South Korea rise so quickly? What structural forces powered its transformation? And why is the country now facing an existential demographic crisis? This article traced South Korea's development from colonization and wars to industrialization and global success. Then we examine the underlying contradictions that now threaten the country's existence. South Korea's modern development story began with colonization. In 1910, Japan annexed the Korean peninsula, started 35 years of colonial rule. During this period, Japan extracted natural resources from Korea, and barely spent money on Korea's infrastructure. By 1945, when Japan surrendered in World War II, Korea had very limited numbers of factories. But the end of colonial rule did not lead to stability. Due to Korean War, which happened immediately after World War II, the peninsula was divided into two states. We all know that South Korea was much more developed and wealthy than the northern neighbor, but it was a totally different story when the two nations were born. It was because the North inherited most of the peninsula's heavy industry, and nearly 80% of mineral resources and much of the colonial-era industrial base. The South was left with almost nothing. It was starkly poorer, with more agricultural land but fewer industrial assets. In the 1950s, some South Koreans even attempted to flee northward. In the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, the entire peninsula was devastated. Over 1 million people died, and industrial facilities were left in ruins. By the end of the war, South Korea's per capita GDP was only $67, approximately 1/35 of the United States. The South was deeply impoverished, and as a result, its economy heavily dependent on foreign, which is basically American aid. In short, South Korea's starting point was one of the most desperate post-war nations. From 1953 to 1961, the United States provided enormous economic assistance to South Korea. It was more than simple support, rather, it practically provided financial life support for the whole country. During this period, U.S. aid made up 60% of South Korea's government budget. It contributed 90% of the country's foreign exchange, and accounted for 70% of South Korea's total investment. South Korea at that time did not have a competitive industrial base, nor export capacity. Its exports mainly consisted of fish, agricultural products, and raw minerals. Unemployment was high, inflation was severe, and political instability was common. Under President Syngman Rhee, the economy was largely stagnant, held together through American aid. Some analysts compare this era to the U.S. occupation and aid programs in Afghanistan: heavy dependence, little structural reform, and no sustainable strategy. South Korea in the late 1950s was an aid-dependent state rather than a fully functional economy. Everything changed in 1961, when a military coup brought Park Chung-hee to power. Park initiated a sweeping transformation that fundamentally altered South Korea's trajectory. His administration created an economic system often described as state capitalism or developmental dictatorship. The core idea was simple but powerful. The government would hand-pick strategic industries and companies that would lead those industries, then Korean government would concentrate all resources to these chosen ones. This model unfolded in several phases. Phase 1 is the import substitution from 1950s to 1960s. After the war, Korea's goal was to rebuild some basic industries and reduce reliance on imports. The government achieved that by imposing high tariffs and import quotas. Korea as a whole borrowed massively from global financial system. But Korea lacked the capital, technology, and natural resources, therefore, this strategy had limited success. After about a decade, Korea entered Phase 2, which is export-oriented industrialization of the late 1960s to 1970s. This was the true takeoff period. Park Chung-hee made several critical decisions. The government hand-picked companies such as Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, by turning them into the privileged few. These firms received extremely cheap financing, preferential access to foreign currency, tax exemptions, and exclusive access to domestic markets. This is the time which the chaebol system was born, vast family-run conglomerates tied closely to the state. With strong chaebol, Korea was able to power itself into Phase 3, which is called heavy and chemical industrialization, running from 1970s till 1990s. This phase ended with the onset of Asian financial crisis in 1998. South Korea pushed into shipbuilding, steel, automobiles, and electronics, industries which are too capital-intensive for most private companies. Again, the government directed the expansion. Hyundai was ordered to enter shipbuilding, POSCO became the national steel champion, Samsung moved aggressively into semiconductors, Kia and Hyundai expanded automobile manufacturing globally. From the late 1960s to the early 1990s, South Korea's GDP grew roughly 10% annually. A nation once exporting seafood and coal began exporting cars, steel, ships, and later semiconductors. As growth matured, South Korea gradually reduced state intervention. In fact, the state almost bankrupted in 1998 crisis. Then Korea was forced into Phase 4 to have market liberalization. During this period, presidents were limited to one term, financial markets were deregulated, foreign investment was allowed and encouraged. Financial system was opening up and tariffs was cut massively. In 1996, South Korea joined the OECD, an event widely celebrated as proof that Korea had become an advanced economy and one of the few nations to successfully escape the middle-income trap. The most distinctive feature of South Korea's economy is the chaebol system, family-controlled commercial empires that dominated nearly every sector in the country. Unlike ordinary corporations, chaebols are characterized by two features. The first one is absolute control by a few families. For example, Samsung is controlled by the Lee family, Hyundai by the Chung family, LG by the Koo family. These families had hundreds of subsidiaries across unrelated industries. They enjoy enormous influence in politics, media, and the public. For decades, the state funneled low-interest loans, foreign exchange, subsidies, and tax benefits to these chaebols. In return, chaebols provided exports, jobs, and national prestige. This created global giants that propelled South Korea's growth but also distorted its economic structure. The hidden cost soon became apparent, characterized by chronic corruption. Almost every South Korean president has been implicated in chaebol scandals. Samsung's leaders have been jailed and pardoned multiple times. A handful of conglomerates control more than 80% of the domestic market in key sectors. This resulted in suppression of small and medium-sized enterprises. Chaebols dominated supply chains, making it nearly impossible for smaller companies to develop. With chaebols offering the top dollar and prestige, millions of young people have to join relentless competition. This fueled a nationwide culture of extreme academic pressure. We can say that Korea's unique system created both prosperity and inequality, economic strength and social rigidity. As critics often joke, Korea is not a country. It is the Republic of Samsung. Over the last 2 decades, many of Korea's structural weaknesses have become worse. The same system that helped create miraculous growth is now generating severe social strain. This includes the world's lowest fertility rate, which is a demographic time bomb. South Korea's fertility rate has fallen to an astonishing 0.72, far below the replacement level of 2.1. It is the lowest birth rate in the world. Population decline is accelerating, and population studies forecasted that, by 2030, 30% of South Koreans will be over age 65, and by 2060, the elderly population will surpass 40%. Some demographers warn that the country is entering a peacetime extinction scenario. Why aren't young Koreans having children? Some blamed extremely high housing prices. Seoul's real estate market is among the most expensive globally. Others pointed to brutal educational competition. Parents feel obligated to spend enormous sums on private tutoring, which is called hagwon culture. South Korea consistently ranks among the longest working nations. Korean females said gender inequality and motherhood is being penalized. Women face overwhelming childcare expectations, workplace discrimination, and career setbacks. Families disintegrate with high divorce rates and unstable work culture. Young people view marriage as emotionally and financially risky. These problems cannot be solved by subsidies alone. They are deeply rooted in the nation's economic structure and cultural norms. South Korea has long been known as the nation of hard work. During the 1970s and 1980s, many workers put in over 2,800 hours per year, essentially trading personal well-being for national progress. Older workers remember this era with a sense of collective sacrifice. We were building the nation with our suffering. But the younger generation no longer accepts this ideology. They prioritize work-life balance, mental health, and personal freedom, values that clash with the old economic model. As of today, South Korea still ranks among the top 5 for longest working hours. Youth depression rates are among the highest in the OECD. Suicide rates remain the highest among developed nations. Young Koreans often describe their society as a survival game, Hell Joseon, and a place where only the top 1% can breathe. The hot show, Squid Game, is merely a reflection of the Korean society. These are not just jokes. They reflect genuine psychological strain produced by decades of intense competitiveness and limited social mobility. Despite global achievements in tech and manufacturing, South Korea's innovation ecosystem faces structural challenges. Chaebols control most consumer markets and supply chains. They bullied startups, therefore, smaller players struggle to survive. SMEs pay far lower wages than big corporations. Young graduates compete intensely for a tiny number of prestigious positions. This creates a rigid class structure that limits creativity and increases social frustration. The core forces that once powered Korea's rise are now weakening. State-directed capital investment no longer yields high returns. Chaebol dominance hinders innovation. The labor force is shrinking rapidly due to low birth rates. The global geopolitical landscape is shifting as China is emerging to be a stronger manufacturer. Shipbuilding is a perfect example here. A few years ago, Korea was still the clear leader in this industry, but now, China is holding much more new orders. South Korea is no longer asking how to sustain high growth. It is asking how to avoid decline. Some analysts propose extreme scenarios where Korea's population could fall below 25 million by the end of the century, a dramatic contraction with serious economic consequences. South Korea achieved a series of remarkable successes. It transformed from a colony to an industrial powerhouse. It rose from wartime devastation to join the OECD. Its culture, K-pop, K-drama, K-beauty, reshaped global entertainment. Its companies, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, dominate global markets. Yet these successes coexist with the lowest fertility rate in the world, overwhelming academic pressure, a hyper-competitive work environment, rigid social hierarchies, rising mental health crises, persistent gender inequality, an aging population and shrinking workforce. The deeper question for South Korea is whether a nation built on sacrifice, discipline, and relentless competition adapt to an era where people value quality of life over national achievement. During periods of rapid growth, citizens were willing to sacrifice. But in a post-growth era, people increasingly choose not to participate in a system that demands too much and returns too little. South Korea offers two important lessons for other fast-developing Asian countries. Lesson 1 is high growth does not last forever. Models built on exhaustion and sacrifice collapse once demographics reverse. Lesson 2 is GDP growth does not automatically translate into social happiness. A society that undermines family life, suppresses mobility, and pressures its youth will eventually face demographic and psychological crises. South Korea shows the limits of hyper-competitive, export-dependent, state-supported industrialization. Its transformation is admirable, but also cautionary. The country's struggle is not simply economic. It is structural, demographic, and cultural. South Korea is both a model of extraordinary national transformation and a warning about the long-term consequences of overdevelopment. Its story teaches us that a strong economy cannot compensate for a collapsed birth rate. A wealthy society can still be deeply unhappy. A powerful industrial base can coexist with rigid class structures. Cultural success cannot prevent demographic decline. South Korea's future will depend on whether it can adjust its social systems as effectively as it once built its industries. The question is whether the country, and its political leadership, can break away from the old model before the demographic crisis becomes irreversible. It is a lesson not just for South Korea, but for OECD, especially East Asia.